I am delighted to be here with you, and I am especially delighted to be collaborating with the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate. I'm going to ask my co-chair, Professor Sumudu Anapatu, to also welcome you, and then we can start the event formally with our hosts.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire. So on behalf of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, I would like to welcome all of you to this event today. Teaching climate law is such an important area, and we will look forward to your interactions as well. So welcome.
Excellent. I think to begin, and we have a packed and very exciting program, so I won't belabor. It's important to recognize that climate law, and indeed the climate change aspects of all areas of law, not just substantive, touching on criminal, tort, contracts, tax and carbon taxes, energy, disaster risk reduction, and the environment, as well as agriculture. Climate law is only just beginning to be taught in our schools in more than just a small component of other courses. And this is something that is developing into the future. But what we would like to focus on today in this event here at COP28 in particular is not just how climate law is making its way into our academy and whether our efforts to teach climate law is truly preparing the generations that are already leading today and will be leading even more in the future to work in interdisciplinary teams with others such as physicists or health specialists or environment schools or public policy or management who need to have the lawyers on their side given the urgency of this challenge. But also worldwide, whether we are engaging our students in a way that will prepare them for the risks and the urgency of climate change. And in particular, we have put this event together to present a few good examples and a few ideas that are now coming into existence and can provide early practices from which we can all learn worldwide. So we will have two brief interventions from incredibly distinguished and hardworking professors teaching climate law in the classrooms. And in particular, we will ask Professor Harro van Asselt, Patent Professor of Climate Law at the University of Cambridge, and Professor Megan Bowman, the professor in King's College London and also director of the King's College London Climate Law Governance Centre, to share very briefly what they're already doing, why is it important, and what they're planning. In just 3 minutes to allow for a real discussion. And that will be our little segment of this roundtable on lessons from the climate law classrooms. We will then ask for further lessons from the clean energy transition classrooms. And in particular, we will invite Dr. Markus Gehring, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Cambridge and a lead counsel of CISGL. And also, we will invite Professor Damilola Olawudi, UNESCO Chair in Environmental Law and Sustainable Development at HPKU in Qatar, and our colleague Nasir Mohammed, who is, of course, our host in the University of Dubai, to share just a little bit about what they are doing in terms of climate law in the classrooms and clean energy transitions in the classrooms and in their universities as a whole. We'll then move to lessons from the field, and again, we have invited Dr. Maya Prabhu, who's a professor of psychiatry and law at the Yale University, and also Advocate Leah McDermott, who runs the Democratizing Education for Global Sustainability and Justice program at the University of Cambridge, to share a little bit about the more innovative teaching that is happening that is reaching far beyond the classroom and the university. So we are greatly looking forward to this day, and we will turn directly to our first two speakers, if you are willing to come to the podium and help us after a few remarks from Sumuru about the exciting developments in this field.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire. So I have been teaching a course on climate change and human rights for the past 10 years, actually, at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And it's one of the few universities in the US that teach a separate course on climate change and human rights specifically. In addition to that, of course, I mean, my international environment law class, my human rights law class has a component on climate law. The university has been trying to do a teaching every year. There is a day that's designated, I think it's in March. It's a worldwide teaching. And no matter what you're teaching, we will teach climate law that particular day. So it's a global effort, which is wonderful. And then I'm also happy to announce that the University of Colombo Law School is launching an LLM in climate law. So I have been working with them in developing the syllabi for that. So that's a very exciting development. The point I want to make is that new areas of law are coming up because of climate change, plus existing areas of law will also be affected by climate change. So no matter what we are teaching, we have to integrate climate law into our teaching. And then, you know, because this is such an interdisciplinary area, we need to integrate climate change into everything we are teaching. So as educators, I think we have a really important role to play, creating awareness and training the future generation of lawyers and policymakers in this very important area. So with that, I will hand this over to Marie-Claire.
So Professor Harold Van Asselt has been teaching climate law and policy in Finland for a number of years, and I first met him when we were founding the Climate Law Governance Initiative in 2005 at McGill University alongside COP28, actually, after the Kyoto Protocol had just entered into force. So I'm very, very honored to welcome him to the floor and also to welcome, of course, him to Cambridge University, where he will be our new professor of climate law. Caro, if you can literally just share what you are already doing, why it's important, and what you plan to do.
Right, I think I will answer maybe at least two of those questions. It was funny, Michael and I were just reflecting very briefly, like a few years ago, Michael had an article on teaching climate law, in which we listed all the postgraduate programs and specialization courses. And already 3 years onwards, it's hopelessly outdated, right? Like we all, at least just this week, I've heard of 3 new courses, 3 new LLMs being launched. So I think that's a telling sign of this field rapidly developing. I'm gonna make 2 points about teaching climate law, and one is actually related also to my plans and my hopes for Cambridge in terms of teaching climate law there. For me, teaching climate law is not necessarily about setting up a new module called climate change law. For me, I think one of the most important things of further integrating climate change in the legal curriculum will be about setting that up throughout the curriculum. So not necessarily just having a course on the UNFCCC or national climate law, but really trying to think about how throughout the curriculum can you start addressing climate change. So how can we train tort lawyers to think about causation in the context of climate change? How can we train investment lawyers to think about fair and equitable treatment in the context of climate change? How can we train contract lawyers to think about how to draft supply chain contracts, again, taking into account, for example, scope 3 emissions? So all of these things, I think we need to start thinking about in terms of mainstreaming climate change across the curriculum. Yes, it might still be useful to, on top of that, for those who really want to specialize, have a separate specialization course in climate law, or indeed have an LLM for those who really want to dig deeper. But I think beyond that, it's going to be really important to try at the undergraduate level, as well as the postgraduate level, to really bring that together and to really try and mainstream that. The other points that I'm going to be briefly mentioning, also reflecting a little bit on the types of teaching that I've done. This should not be, and this is how many people start teaching climate change law. They go to the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and of course, it's a crucial part of it, but it's not all, it's not the whole story. But then, if you look at the national law, like so, for example, UK climate change law, even if you would look beyond the UK Climate Change Act, again, if you just look at the UK and the international level, again, you're not telling the whole story. You need to really try and bring the comparative element in. You need to look how norms might diffuse across jurisdictions. You need to look at the transjudicial dialogues that are taking place in climate litigation. So really to try and have a proper picture of what climate law is about, you need to have this comparative perspective, this global perspective. So those will be my very two short messages, and I'll hand it back over to you, Marie-Claire.
Lessons from the climate law classroom, Professor Harro van Assel. Thank you. I will now call upon Professor Megan Bowman, who has joined us online. If she could just tell us, what are you already doing? Why is it important? And what do you plan to do? And then we will pass to, of course, lessons from climate law degrees with our special guests, Nasir and Sonam from Bhutan and Dubai.
Thank you so much.
Megan?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Good. Good. Thumbs up. Thank you, Harro. Thank you, Marie-Claire and Smudu and to the whole crew over there. It sounds very busy, very exciting, and you're doing amazing work. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. So I just want to say, yeah, a couple of things. Sometimes when teaching climate law, I'm asked, where do you begin? And one of the places that I like to begin is actually two things I like to sort of begin with. One is the science, so that we are all on the same page as to why teaching climate law and the legal and regulatory dimensions of climate related subject matter is so important. And I find that focuses the minds of the people in the classroom very, very quickly when we talk about the science, the why do we care factor, the who cares factor. And it's really interesting because I think I'm learning that we can't take that for granted, that people know the science and that they understand the science, and the imperatives that are calling lawyers and governance specialists to the foreground. So that's one of the places that I begin, and that's with the IPCC report, the Global Stocktake report, the Univ emissions gap report, all of this, these professional scientific reports telling us very clearly that we are on track for a 3-degree world by the end of the century if we do not have global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And a 3-degree world is an unlivable world, and that needs to be stated clearly and upfront for everyone to be on the same page and excited about the subject matter. So that's one of the places I begin. The other place that I begin is with the narrative. And particularly one of the courses that I teach, actually, Harro was speaking about. Yeah? Sorry?
2-minute warning, Megan.
Wow, I thought that took 10 seconds. That's hilarious. All right, well then, okay. Time's different when you're online.
Questions and discussions. So roundtable rapid fire.
Okay, good. And then the second thing I think really is the narrative, and one of the places that I begin, particularly when I'm teaching about sustainable finance, is the Mark Carney speech in 2015, before the Paris Agreement was adopted, actually, in relation to climate change being a material financial risk for all corporations and markets. And as soon as we can understand that climate change is not just the realm of tree-hugging hippies, but actually on the desks of CEOs and directors around the world, then I think that also helps to focus minds. And that helps to feed into the sorts of things that Harro was talking about, which is integrating it, climate-related concepts into traditionally non-green subjects like corporate law, commercial law, corporate governance, and tort law. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Megan. And we will have many questions for you. Thank you so much as well for joining us 4 hours earlier than our current time. I'm now going to introduce two other speakers in our roundtable who in particular have been leading from the front, from Dubai here in the Middle East, North Africa region, and from Bhutan coming all of this way in order to share with us. And they will share with us just 2 lessons from climate law degrees, again focusing on what are you already doing, what are you planning to do, why is it important. First, I will invite Professor Sonam Cherry, who is Assistant Dean and Professor at the Yingmi Wangchuk Law, JSW Law in Bhutan, if he can share those 3 points.
Good morning, everyone. Just to be very brief to this roundtable rapid fire. In terms of the law school, it's around 7 years old. The law school is very young. But having said that, we have already instituted the JSW Law Climate Change and Environmental Center. And under this, we have the bachelor's degree, who also takes elective courses, which has already been done on climate change and environmental policy. And then in plan, we have 2 more coming in, more exciting ones. The one is we are coming up with the LLM, international LLM on climate change law and policy, and also interdisciplinary masters on climate change and policy. Then we'll also be launching the clinical courses for the undergrads as well as for the master's degree by 2024. And in terms of why do we actually offer these courses? One, because Bhutan's constitution mandates we have 60% forest coverage all times, and we still have over 70%. Bhutan is also one of the carbon negative for now, but we remain committed to remain carbon neutral. The other one is Bhutan is based on the gross national happiness, and one of the pillars for gross national happiness, which is a developmental philosophy, is that to environmental protection and conservation as a major component. So I think because of all these reasons, there are too many reasons to actually explain, but because of these major reasons, we feel that we can be a champion in terms of climate change leadership, and we want to be a hub of the regional hub for the climate change environmental related legal courses and academic discourse and research.
I anticipate many guests coming to be visiting professors in your new LLM. We've all heard about GAUC's national happiness, and it is such an honor to host you here and to know that you're leading the world in this area. We also understand the imperative for your country. I will now turn to Professor Nasir, who of course hosted us in the Climate Law and Governance Legal Specialization course in a truly extraordinary campus in the desert outside Dubai. And I would like Nasir to just share a little bit about what you're already doing, what you're planning to do, and why it's important.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I will. More particularly, if you look at my seat, it looks like Burj Khalifa. So you can all hear my voice. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. In terms of what we're doing, we just like what Professor mentioned. When it comes to climate change, we probably need to think around just a specialization. So at our current stage, we do not yet have a specialized program, but we're integrating climate change more in all our curriculum. And it is important also to know that this is not just our own initiative, but it is Ministry of Education's initiative. In the United Arab Emirates, as we know, we're regulated by CAA. So one of the requirements for accreditation of all courses is there has to be integration of climate change. So in the law school, what we're doing is to integrate teaching, or to integrate subtopics inside our curriculum. For instance, just last week I was teaching litigation class, and one of the things that I told Mary there and Christina at that time, it's okay. We're going to introduce climate change mitigation into that curriculum. So these are some of the things that we do. We have another course on international investment law. And as Professor Hoole mentioned, there is need to consider integrating climate change obligations in climate equitable treatment. And these are some of the things that I've been doing for the last 3 years, right? So, in terms of why this is important, there is no gainsaying. This is United Arab Emirates. The climate change is real here. The studies have shown rising of the sea levels. So, the government is very much in support of all initiatives that will integrate climate change. So, for instance, we'll start with our College of Engineering. We have scenario labs that look at the sea level rise, and what the university has done is actually to integrate the program in such a way that students would learn from the scenario labs. Very clear mention about our campus, so it's important to mention that as well, that we are number one campus in the whole world, completely net zero. So this is one thing that makes us really unique in terms of integrating climate change in terms of what we do. Lastly, what do we plan to do? So thanks to CISDL and my collaboration with Mary Claire and her team, we are thinking of coming up with a whole or full-blown program, climate change law and policy. And the reason for that is when we started discussing this, currently we have 2 master's programs. And these 2 master's programs are informed by the strategic plan of the Dubai Chamber of Commerce. As a university, we are owned by the Dubai Chamber of Commerce. And now sustainability is one of those strategic goals. So we are trying to align what we want to do in the law school with strategic objectives of the university and also the Dubai Chamber of Commerce. So hopefully with the support of experts, CISD and colleagues from Cambridge, we're going to launch this document. So there are so many things that need to go into this as well. There has to be planned, there has to be processed. So we are working on the documentation, and after that we take this to the management of the university and we make a convincing case why it should be open. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well, and I understand that we're having a bit of trouble for our online participants to be able to hear us. So we will do our very best to project our voice and work within the limits of the space and the technology. But I do think that hosting the COP28, if there's one thing that is a global alliance of universities on climate we leave behind here in Dubai, it should be your new climate law and policy course or LLM. So thank you so much, Nasir, for the work that you are doing. And I hope you can count on all of our colleagues here and in our broader network in support, both for your leadership in Bhutan and for your leadership here in Dubai. We can certainly see, and even more so after the sessions about the rising sea levels and the warming of the oceans that is destroying the marine wildlife yesterday, how important it is for you here in Dubai and for the entire Gulf and the Middle East and Africa region as well. I would now like to turn online to Professor Markus Gehring, who has kindly agreed to share one lesson from teaching climate law and clean energy transitions, and also one why it's important and what he plans to do. Markus.
Thank you very much, Mary Claire, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's wonderful to see so many dedicated climate law teachers in one room, in one event. We've been teaching climate law in the context of the energy transition, in particular in the context of sustainable development, since 2012 in the University of Cambridge. And before that, we had courses at the University of Montreal, the University of Ottawa. And the experience is that I wanted to share with this event is that there are so many course participants, students, professionals interested not just in energy law, not just in electricity law, which is becoming rapidly the new version of energy law, but also in the law of the legal transition. And you've heard already from Marie-Claire that there is a capacity chasm. 162 NDCs foresee legal and policy changes in the context of climate change, and energy is, of course, a big part of that. So I could also I could only invite anyone who's currently teaching a standard energy law course to start thinking about focusing more on electricity, on smart grids, on how to transition from a conventional source of energy to all the rules and regulations that we need for renewable energy. I know colleagues teach dedicated courses just on offshore wind, because of course, if you're doing it in an international, transnational context, the questions are many, and the legal analysis that is necessary is very complex. Just a shout out to Harrow, my colleague at Hoole. What we're going to launch next week in Hoole is the updated climate law atlas, where we're not just looking at traditionally closely related areas of law and how they cut across climate change, but also at contract law, at labor law, at construction law, at local planning law, and not just in England and Wales, but also in the new version in North America. So watch the space. I can only encourage all lawyers to start thinking about how climate law is really a cross-cutting issue. And if I can finish on one point, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada recommended to integrate Canadian Indigenous law into the legal curriculum. I think we need a similar call for any legal education to include a mandatory component on climate law. Thank you very much, Marika.
Thank you very much, Markus. Deeply appreciated. And I understand that Professor Damilola has been delayed, and so I will move straight to lessons from beyond the classroom and beyond the degrees. And here I would like to first, of course, invite Dr. Maya Prabhu and Advocate Mead McDermott to say a few words each. And then if he will permit us, we happen to have the editor of one of the leading journals in the world sitting in our front row, and I would give him just a minute and a half maybe to share a little bit about the work with students on a journal in this field. Truly one of the pioneers. So I will invite Maya and then Maeve. Professor Maya Prabhu, of course, is an associate professor of psychiatry and law at Yale University, and has also been, since our founding over 20 years ago, the Council of Health Law for CISDL. Maya, the floor is yours. What are you doing? Why is it important? And what are you planning to do beyond the classroom in these areas?
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and I hope that you're having a productive COP. Feel free to be in touch to cross-pollinate, which is the theme of my comments here, but the importance of cross-pollinating across fields, and yes, even teaching climate change law to non-lawyers. Since 2018, since we had our first large symposium on climate change change. My particular area of interest is climate change migration. And we had a large conference at Yale looking at the legal issues related to climate-induced displacement. I have found I've been reinforcing the value of teaching climate change law to non-lawyers, particularly scientists and other people across fields, and even in their respective areas of work. I have to say that students and faculty nowadays are deeply interested in issues beyond their subject matter expertise, but often struggle to know how to translate their research and their scholarship into something practical. And so by providing individuals with the basics of how a negotiating process works, how the legal structure works, why international and regional laws matter, you're creating a constituency for change. You're helping educate policymakers in adjacent fields, even if they're not lawyers. And obviously you're creating a constituency for political pressure, which is really valuable. I will also add, it can be very helpful for you as lawyers yourself. I have found both unexpected collaborators and, importantly, unexpected funders, simply because you're reaching larger audiences and a different audience than you would when you're speaking to a set of lawyers. And again, of course, people across disciplines are going to have insights into the implications of the work for their field, and it can also make for law that is more nuanced, more precise, and perhaps have a better, more accurate metrics, because in the end, we always want to sort of capture the impact and the effectiveness of the policies or laws that we're advocating for. So I have actually incorporated climate change law into teaching that I do every year with physicians in training. I incorporate it into a negotiation exercise. I incorporate it into research on and education on refugees and migrants and their health needs. And of course, at the law school, which actually has a mixed class of students, which involves graduate students, policy students, and even students in the social sciences, they're always very interested. And by the way, it will also prove intellectually challenging for you as lawyers. And I think it makes us, students outside of the law ask very basic questions at times, like, does international law still matter? Or how do I have an impact in international law? Or how can I incorporate international law into the local level or city level or state level? These are important questions, I think, to answer for people who might find themselves in positions of power. And it's good for us to be reminded that we still have to educate people about why international and regional law matters. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering your questions. But go forth and teach non-lawyers. It will be very valuable for the work and for you too.
Well, that is a perfect segue to our next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Maya Prabhu, coming to us live from Yale University. I can't even imagine what time it is for you. And I'm now going to turn to Advocate Maeve McDermott to speak exactly about teaching non-lawyers worldwide.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with each of you. As Professor Mary Claire mentioned, my name is Maeve McDermott, and I'm the coordinator for the Democratizing Education for Global Sustainability and Justice program, which is a program that was launched this past year by the University of Cambridge and international partners, and it aims to democratize education on sustainable development, law, and policy, as well as to strengthen capacity by developing online courses that are made widely available to current and future law and policy leaders around the world, and especially in low-income and highly climate-vulnerable countries. So thanks to a very generous donation, we're able to offer these courses at no cost for all of our learners. So far, we have 4 key essential courses on different areas of sustainable development, law, and policy, including one on the Paris Agreement, sustainable development, and the law. These courses are largely asynchronous, self-paced courses with approximately 8 hours of taught material, and I'm delighted to see that amongst the people in the room, we have some professors that have contributed to these taught recordings. So we have pre-recorded lectures and supervision sessions from professors such as the ones here from the University of Cambridge and esteemed universities around the world. We have resources to various articles and websites online for the learners. And then we also use examples of domestic laws and policies that have been internationally recognized and ask students to complete writing assignments to explore policies and laws in their own jurisdictions and to brainstorm ideas for further implementation of the Paris Agreement within their countries. The program aims to convene and support global engagement and communities of practice, and so to this end, we include 2 live sessions during each of the course offerings, with breakout groups for learners to meet other law and policy leaders from different regions of the world. We also have forums on the teaching platform. We use Moodle for engagement among the cohort, and a LinkedIn group network for learners and alumni to share opportunities for collaboration later on. So I'm delighted to announce that after a successful pilot program in the spring, we revised the courses, and in this past fall, we just finished, we had 6,171 expressions of interest, and we were delighted to have 2,299 learners selected from 126 countries across the world to complete the 4 courses. And of those learners, we had 633 learners complete the Paris Agreement course from 104 countries. And so I would say that why is it important? I don't want to take up too much time, but as we've heard, there is a capacity chasm. Valeria Zambianchi has done excellent research indicating that of 169 out of the 186 countries that had submitted their nationally determined contributions at the time called for the importance of legal and institutional reform within their countries. We've also heard from our colleagues at the IBA that of the 80,000 individual lawyers and 190 bar associations and law societies in the world, very few, only a handful, offer a committee on sustainable development law, and of these, most were founded only within the last 5 years. And then across the world's 40 most highly climate vulnerable low-income countries, again, very few have their own university law school, and even fewer of these offer legal or public administration courses for students as the next generation of law and policy leaders. So what we're planning to do, we have we're using a network of course ambassadors, so people that have previously taken the course, to spread the word about these courses within bar associations, within different governments and ministries, to students that might be interested in taking these courses, to really try to scale up to reach more learners worldwide, to scale up to reach thousands of learners. And then we're adding 2 additional courses, which I don't think I'll mention at this time, but look forward to announcing soon. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Maeve McDermott, thank you. I will ask if Professor Michael Maley kindly can share just one last lesson outside the classroom, and in particular, the role of law journals in this field. And given what you've done with the Carbon Markets Law Review, please, Professor Maley from MIT.
All right, I'm home too, but very quickly, I was thinking sort of 3 observations, and I'll keep them very short. The first one, Mary Claire, you'll surely relate to. 20 years ago, when we were thinking about climate law, a lot of the topics that were discussed or that were written about in the Carbon and Climate Law Review, for instance, in the inaugural issue in 2007, how it contributed to that, are the same ones that we're still discussing. And I think that tells us that 20 years from now, we'll still be writing and researching about a lot of them. There's I think a tendency to assume that everything moves forward and new topics come up. The balances shift, the importance of different issues shift, but by and large, the issues have kind of really remained consistent. Litigation was there, CCS was there, hydrogen geoengineering 20 years ago. The second thing I would say is that journals, back then it was easy to kind of launch a specialized journal because there was no forum, and other mainstream environmental law journals didn't really think of climate as such an important issue. Now they cannot ignore it. Half their articles often are. So it becomes harder for journals, but also for programs to position themselves along traditional environmental programs or journals that are broadening their scope. And the last point I want to make is also in teaching, I very much encourage, young lawyers coming to climate law feel it's a tool, it's an instrument to get movement into some very, very intractable problems, something to get outcomes. And there's a tendency to neglect that you have to understand the overall landscape of the law to know where it's coming from and to know what deep embedded structures in the law have got us to where we are now, and that we have to slowly amend and change to superate those. And litigation can be a great tool, but you also have to understand contract law, tort law, constitutional law, etc. So 3 sort of quick takeaways. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Maley. Deeply, deeply appreciated your efforts in this field. We're going to turn, because we've had these incredibly disciplined speakers who have kept to the 2 minutes, we're going to turn to our quite impressive audience here in the COP28 and ask if you have a few comments or questions that you could share with us. And I'd like to especially invite you to speak to our colleagues from Bhutan, from Dubai, from other parts of the world who are here with us, giving advice and ideas, not just questions. Starting with Megan Bowman, who kindly cut her speech online very, very briefly. I'd also like to welcome Professor Damilola, who I understand has now joined us, and ask him if he could give us closing remarks, given that he was not able to be there during his time on our roundtable, and we are rapid fire. So I'm going to turn to my co-chair, Professor Samudu, to take questions and answers and direct them online. And I will help us to start by asking if Megan Bowman can explain maybe just one challenge she's run into running what I understand is one of the world's first climate law and governance centers. So that's my first question in the round of maybe three that Samudu might want to take.
Sure. Let's take 3 questions, and then when you're asking a question, please identify yourself and your institution, and please make it brief. Okay, we have one. Yep.
So I'm also a faculty of law from where my colleague is from, Bhutan, and my apologies if the question sounds very silly, but it's an important one for us because, as my colleague earlier said, our law school is a very new law school. So taking advantage of the fact that there are many experienced. Okay. Okay. So can I continue?
Yeah. Sure.
So taking advantage of the fact that there are many experienced professors who are teaching climate law, running climate centers and all of that, can you share with us, the colleagues from Bhutan, what are some of the things that we can do to make sure that our climate center, the courses that we teach are the ones that is effective for Bhutan and the other law students? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, next question, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Neda. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. I have just completed my LLM by dissertation in climate change mitigation and written a 50,000 word dissertation. So my question is, and well done on everybody, including and pledging to include climate law as part of the curriculum. And as Mary Claire asked for comments, I was just wondering, Professor Ian Frey, the UN first rapporteur in the context of human rights and social and climate change, has in his 2023 report called for training manuals and programs for judges to be trained in the context of climate change and mitigation. So would these programs then be accessible to that extent?
Thank you so much. So let's take a round of answers before we move on to the next round of questions. So obstacles, lessons learned, and training programs for judges.
Thank you. Shall I begin? Great. Thank you so much for the question, Mary Claire, and thank you for the questions in the room. I shall answer Mary Claire's question that she so kindly directed to me. And I guess one of the things that we sort of have learnt very quickly in our Climate Law and Governance Centre at King's College London is that the teaching needs to be research informed. So the research that we do also links to external engagement. So it's those 3 things. The teaching is research informed, and that links to external engagement and impact in meaningful ways. And particularly we sort of do that in 4 areas, like the energy transition, litigation, sustainable finance and business, and also environmental justice. And across those 4 areas, I think we're sort of learning that it's not just excellence that is important in this space, but also inclusivity and dynamism that we're all learning from each other. So it's a big ambitious sort of stage that we've set for ourselves, but it's an all-female centre actually, and that brings with it some of the most incredible opportunities for collaboration and collegiality, and we take that work into the world by role modelling it. And I know that in the room you have with you Shamal, who's one of our the members of one of our centres here. Give us a wave, Shamal. There she is, yay. So so we're out there and amongst it, so thank you.
Anybody online would like to add anything to the questions or answer any of the questions before we move to the in-person resource people? Yeah, Markus.
Yeah, just a brief reflection on Zenaida's excellent question, right? So I think we all need to sort of come together to broaden the access on this very important topic. And climate change, by virtue of it being a global challenge, also requires participation from all parts of the world. So just teaching climate law in the north or just teaching climate law in particular parts of the world is not going to get us there. We need to, as Maeve said, we need to democratize climate change education around the world. And while that might be challenging, it's not an impossible task.
Thank you, Markus. Maya, do you have anything to add?
I think, no, my points were made by both. I'm happy to get to another round of questions so other people can ask what they would like.
Thanks. Any of the other resource people? Yeah.
I'll just respond to the second one. First one was asked by my friend. On the second, on the terms of judges in Bhutan is not the issue because we are the only law school. We produce lawyers and we make sure that they learn about climate change. And at the same time, we also in the process of developing executive trainings for those who are already in the field, parliamentarians, local governments, and all of those. And the law school's emphasis on climate change is a huge priority. You can see some of the young people here. We managed to bring in 4 of our students from Bhutan for the first time, and basically to have their voice at the top. So we really believe in having, actual participation of the youth. That is why our climate clinical courses are basically towards participation in the community services and helping them to engage, including, environmental education services.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you very much. I think to the question that talked about the need to engage the judges in terms of climate mitigation. What I would just say from my experience here in the Middle East, and in particular in university, we do have among our graduate students actually judges, serving judges. So I believe that introducing a program like this would obviously expose them into the nuts and bolts of climate change. Thank you very much.
Great. Before we move on to the next round of questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to add regarding judges, I think we see, at least in our course, we have some judges that take this course, but we also see that some individual countries do an excellent job of involving their judiciaries. For instance, we just went to an event at the Pakistan Pavilion yesterday where they've brought in members of their high-level members of their judiciary to COP itself. But we are trying to find other ways to involve members, judges from around the world within these kind of global courses as well. So.
Yeah, if I may add to that about the judges, there is a former Supreme Court judge from Hawaii. He has been going around attending and actually doing these training programs for judges around the world. So there's a lot going on. And if you're interested, I can put you in touch with him. Yeah. Next round of questions. Yeah.
As a global educated network, we never said that we are refugees because nobody knows. But what we said that we are most.
Thank you. My name is Pedro. I'm coming from Ethiopia. I run a local civil society organization, but I've also been a faculty for work for university since 2013. And my question goes to the fact that when new law students come into the law school, we teach them about the purpose of the law as being an instrument to serve justice. And when we take a look at climate issues, there is a strong injustice all over the world in how the climate impact is shaping up. I was wondering what each of your universities or also as an alliance what you are doing in terms of making sure that the injustice in terms of climate change is addressed, especially those institutions that are in the global north. How are you working to influence your local governments? Thank you.
Next question, please. Yeah. Sorry, do you mind coming here?
Thank you. My name is Jiao. Many professors mentioned here is that this subject is related with all kinds of areas, tort law, contract law, international law. So my question is very simple. How can one professor know so many subjects?
Wonderful. Great question. One more question. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Surya Satyana. I'm working as a researcher at Cambridge on AI for climate models. I've also been helping out with a few of the courses Dave mentioned earlier. So my question was kind of going off what Professor Prabhu was saying about getting people in different disciplines involved with climate law. And I know that there's been great initiatives already to try to democratize the education. And I was wondering, how do you see this going forward? How do you get more people involved from not just the law perspective, but also engineers or physicists or people who do have a huge impact on climate change? So that's kind of what I was wondering.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of Cambridge University's top physics and mathematicians, by the way.
Wow. Before I turn to the panelists, I can answer that question because I have opened my classes. I teach in the law school, but my classes are open to other graduate students. So I get, science graduates, engineering, business. So that's a way of, opening our classes. And it's easy to do in the US. I don't know how easy it is to do in other parts of the world, but that's one. And I also must mention our climate law initiative that we started in my law school because I work in a very large university. And, we don't know what other colleagues are doing. And in a way to sort of bridge the gap between, the science and natural sciences and social sciences and law, we started this initiative to show how important the legal aspects are. So we are slowly sort of, getting colleagues from the other side of campus to come to the law school to learn about the initiative, etc. So, yeah. So who would like to take this round of questions? Harold.
I just wanted to respond to Jima's question on covering many fields. I think that it is a really difficult challenge for anyone working on climate change. And no, we cannot be experts in investment law and trade law, human rights law, constitutional law, all at the same time. But I do think that what we can do is have basic training in each of these subjects. And then every once in a while we can dive more deeply. For students, of course, the place to do that would be generally through dissertations and master theses or undergraduate theses. For researchers, I think one of the ways of doing it is through research projects. And then the other solution, and I think this also applies to the classroom, is collaboration. One of the best ways for me to learn about investment law would be to work with investment lawyers who know the area inside out. Or likewise with human rights lawyers and writing pieces together. So students, of course, can do the same. Students can work with other students who are very much interested in another subject. So I think this is one of the ways to overcome that challenge. But I do think it's one of the core challenges. If you're going to have a career in climate law, you cannot just narrowly focus on one piece of law. You need to cover the breadth.
Absolutely.
I'd like to add to that because this year I served as visiting professor at Yale Law School, and we were piloting a new course with my new OUP textbook on sustainable development law and governance. And of course, SDG 13, climate action, featured very, very strongly in our session. we were able to share and throw open our course to all of the other graduate faculties who joined us at Yale Law School to learn about climate law. And then we held extra sessions to talk about the COP and the climate change problem, starting from the science like Megan does and going into the law. And we were astounded by the high level of interest with the students. I think the only other aspect that I would add is that when I led legal preparedness for climate change, helping countries around the world that asked the UN and the International Development Law Organization for assistance in reforming their regulations to address climate change, we looked at mitigation, adaptation and resilience, and finance. And we found, of course, that in all areas and all government departments, there were important legal barriers that had not yet been taken down. Even something as simple as a ridiculous counter-incentive in a tax code can make a difference if a good team of students looks at it and proposes a reversal of the incentive to a credit. So I strongly, strongly echo the points of my colleagues that, you know, in a way, what Harrow politely calls collaboration, I call making friends. And you wouldn't believe the new friends I have who are tort lawyers and criminal lawyers and contract lawyers just in the last little while. Really? Your company has a net zero commitment. Do you put that in all your contracts, including when you hire external counsel? No? You haven't revised your contracts for 30 years? It would be a wonderful idea to make sure your net zero commitment is in those supply chain contracts. Don't you think? I would love to hear more thoughts. And it works. So I agree with my colleagues, and we'll let others on the panel answer these questions as well.
Maybe I think I will be able to answer both the questions together. How do you know all the laws? One of the things the law school has planned is we have actually signed an MOU and partnering with the institute, which is nothing to do with law. They are experts on science, you know, agriculture, energy, all of those, and we are partnering with strongly in terms of exchanging of faculty. So our faculty would be going there to teach climate law, and they would be coming to our law school to teach about climate science. And similarly, if you look at the courses that we have designed, one course we are planning to have is Masters in Legal Studies, which will be open to anybody interested in learning climate law vis-a-vis other climate aspects. So which means that we have prepared enough to make sure that it is not isolated to law, but rather it is a interdisciplinary and it can reach to anybody interested about learning climate law and other laws.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I think I would simply respond to the question about more disciplines involved in climate law specialization. Just a little background about myself. Very clear knows very well. I started as an energy lawyer. Now, what does it take to be an energy lawyer? You have to take the courses in geology, you have to take courses in finance, you have to take courses in economics, right? Because after going through all that, then you start specializing in more. So the same thing with climate change. You have to take some courses in climate science, right? So you need to understand that. So that's what I think, what it takes to build a very good and solid curriculum. The other option is probably to consider offering MSc in law. So where you can allow non-lawyers to come, and then they take introduction to law courses, and then they can be integrated. There are lots of models out there. Thank you very much.
Okay, Maya? Oh, sorry.
Sure, just a few other thoughts, because I think one of the questions was how we continue to reach out to people beyond our usual school or constituency. Just a reminder that it can be you can take a topic, for example, your particular area within climate change law, and present it at conferences, either at your local educational institution or beyond, and there's such an interest in climate change. I invariably have had multiple papers accepted on climate change at medical conferences, psychiatric conferences, and other public health conferences. And a way that you can do it is frame it in terms of an introduction to climate change law, financing, whatever the case might be, for physicians, for nurses, for whatever your audience is. And people will are very interested. It's also a very useful area for writing and scholarship. So be sure to be intentional about reaching across journals and writing, again, in a rudimentary way, but we're trying to create a constituency that's interested. And one of the questions was, how do you learn about everything you need to learn? And of course, the answer is you can't become an expert in all the areas. But this is a very nice area for inviting guest lecturers, particularly junior lecturers, people who are up and coming in the field, who are often eager to have an opportunity to say that they were a guest lecturer at the University of Cambridge, Bhutan. We're all looking for interesting opportunities. So it's a lovely way to elevate somebody with some expertise. And I will also say this, particularly if you're thinking about educating non-lawyers, you do not need to get the world's expert in the field to educate them. Truthfully, they only need to be a little bit more educated than the students themselves, and that can be valuable. So just some additional tools to think about.
Sorry, May, you had a...
Oh, thank you so much. We had so many brilliant questions, but we had one on how to integrate justice, and climate justice or environmental justice into these programs. And I think we view kind of for our program, our role in that as creating an opportunity to support lawyers or law and policy leaders with the resources and maybe some best practice examples, so that then they can go and promote this environmental justice, climate justice within their jurisdictions. And so to that end, we feel that it's very important to offer, particularly in our program, these courses at no cost, so that it can be as accessible as possible for people around the world. And that's also why we offer it entirely online, so that people that might not have the opportunity to come do an LLM for a year or two in a country abroad will still have the same opportunity to at least get a primer and to be able to know where they can find their information.
Thank you very much, Maeve, and thank you for the incredible work that you have been doing to democratize education on these issues worldwide. She doesn't sleep. We have a round of applause for Maeve and Tejas and Balsa, the entire team.
Okay, I will now hand over to Marie-Claire to conclude this session, I guess.
Thank you very much. I understand we've been joined online by Professor Damilola Olawuyi. Dami, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful, welcome. And would you like to just say a few closing remarks, having had the opportunity to listen to a few of the conversations here about teaching climate law and the clean energy transition from the perspective of what I would call the coalface, where you are in Qatar with HBKU, teaching students from around the world on these issues under your UNESCO chair, and also as vice chair of Nigeria's of the International Law Association and head of Nigeria's International Law branch.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. And let me start by saying a big congratulations to the Center for International Sustainable Development Law and partners for another wonderful event. I'm always inspired by the amount of energy and innovation you put into organizing this important capacity development event, which align with the goals of the International Law Association as well as our regional network, the Association of Environmental Law Lecturers. I've listened very carefully to the very thoughtful, proposals, and I agree 100%. Addressing a climate emergency requires innovation. And that innovation should not only come from scientists or engineers, it should also come from lawyers and legal educators. And in the region, we talk a lot about a just transition. And these days, we are seeing the need. And I want to call on Professor Sumudu and professors of teaching that are here, that we need more innovation in teaching climate law. So, for example, we see that the International Bar Association is calling for clauses in energy contracts, like just transition clauses. They need to put in the contract that in order to deliver a transition, it should be just, it should be inclusive. What does a just transition mean? These days, energy contracts should define that, should define a just transition clause, should define an inclusivity clause, a vulnerability assessment clause, human right due diligence clause. That is when we can, that is the sort of legal innovation in our contracts that will lead us to the solutions that we all really, really want to see. And hopefully we will see Professor Sumudu will write another book that would enlighten us on how to teach, how to prepare energy lawyers for a just transition. And I can assure you, I will be the first to buy that. That said, I want to again thank you for the opportunity, and I want to assure you of our ongoing commitment to always support the innovation of CISDL, and we look forward to more of such important events in years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the International Law Association, the Association of Middle Eastern Environmental Law Lecturers, whose mandate is so incredibly relevant to what we are doing here in Dubai. And thank you especially to University of Dubai, to JSW Law, in 7 years old in Bhutan, to University of Wisconsin and Sumudu, especially you as an expert in our field and a grandmother of, and the writer of many of the textbooks that we use. I want to especially also thank Harrow and my other colleagues, Professor Markus Gehring online, and the others, especially those who have helped to make my new visiting chair in Sustainable Law and Policy a reality in the University of Cambridge. First one, first woman. And I would especially like to, speaking of incredible young women who are leading in this field, thank Advocate Maeve McDermott, also Susan and Antoinette and Tejas and Freya and Zenaida, the others who are here, who are working so hard on democratizing education on these issues. I do need to point out that there's a 12-hour difference between here and one of our partners, University of Victoria, who are collaborating with Bhutan Law. And yet some of those students and professors are online with us, despite it being nearly midnight for them. And they are strongly working on teaching climate law and governance in their university, along with others worldwide who are starting to lead this charge. And I find that incredibly inspiring. In the Pakistan Pavilion, we had the judiciary, including the Chief Justice, coming forward, showing us what was happening in terms of the flooding. We see the same thing in Canada with the wildfires that are destroying our country. We've seen the same thing in Cambridge with the floods that are coming closer every year and the coastline that is creeping up and taking villages off cliffs. We've seen the same thing here in Dubai with Dubai's oceans heating and some of their most important areas now looking to be underwater. The glaciers that are melting in your area of the world, my friend Sonam. I think that all of us carry inside us now the urgency of this challenge. We're at 1.3 degrees, 0.2 degrees to turn it around, and the pathway, if we cannot do this, is lost. So I think it's incredibly important to just underline not just the need to address this capacity chasm that we've spoken about in our law schools, in our universities in general, in the schools at all levels, at the secondary, at the primary level, and also in all of the other spaces where there's a chance to build that community. As I've said before, there are not 110,000 people registered to this COP because we managed to solve the problem. And we need hundreds and hundreds of thousands more. And one of the ways to do that is by turning all of our institutions that are there in order to help us to address global problems that are of such existential humanitarian justice relevance towards addressing climate change. I'm going to close by mentioning what the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan mentioned yesterday, and it is that you can discuss environmental justice, but if you do that, you risk leaving out adaptation and resilience. You risk leaving out net zero investment, trade, and finance. You risk leaving out essentially the other two main objectives of the Paris Agreement. The faster that we can, not just in all areas of the law, from criminal cases and climate litigation to tax law and energy law, start to integrate climate change into our classes, and also, as much as possible, launch new LLMs, new clinics, new programs. For our tiny piece of the puzzle, I'm very, very happy to announce, together with all of our colleagues who are working on it, and Professor Christina Voigt, chair of the IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law, a professor in Oslo, and also co-editor of a new book coming out with Routledge on climate change, courage, contributions, and compliance. We're doing our best as well to provide you, together with Professor Sumudu Antapatu and others, with some of the textbooks and research handbooks and human rights and climate justice books that you might need to teach these courses. I think it would be probably worthwhile, in an insane and crazy and desperate way, to, without consulting my colleagues, ask, I'll put it as an invitation, maybe even a call. I won't go to demand because I think the call will be answered. If perhaps the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate might be able to create a commission which will share curricula, syllabi, and other materials to help us to teach climate law in the future. And I think that is one thing that, if we are in agreement, we can start here today, that would at least give an answer to our colleagues from Dubai, from Bhutan, and from other places around the world that are just launching teaching in this area, and to do our best as a global community to respond to the desperate need. Is that fair?
Actually, if I can add to that, we have already started doing that, Marie-Claire.
Excellent.
The Climate Law Initiative started collecting syllabi from across campus, and I'm really happy to host other colleagues if they're interested in sharing their syllabi with us. So
wonderful.
We have already started.
So we may have Wisconsin, Cambridge, Dubai, Bhutan as a beginning place to start. And if our colleagues from the Global University Alliance would like to join, Xinhua, you are offering. Thank you. We have more partners already joining. And we will try to do, if everyone would like to come up, one photograph to be able to launch this initiative, to join with what Wisconsin is doing and build on it globally. Thank you.
All right, so we'll start then. So welcome everyone for joining us in person and online. I'm Dr. Antoinette Nestor, and I will be giving you the opening remarks as well as acting as the moderator of this session. So multitasking. Now, the title of this session is I'll Build You for Repairs, Early Career Researchers Discuss Climate Repairs and Reparations. And I wanted to thank the Global Alliance on Justice Education for facilitating the pavilion today. And now, before I forget, we need to set this session to record. So apologies for stopping that. Oh yeah, it is recorded, that's good, okay. Now, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. Now, I'll just give a very, very short introduction and ask the researchers to actually introduce themselves a bit more. So we have Elilini Hoole, Jessica Crow, and Karry Jiao and Tejas Rao from the University of Cambridge. And we have Pedro Schilling de Carvalho. And I forgot my notes. Sorry, Pedro, but you can actually tell what is at UCL about your credentials. Now, before we move on, and now I'm just going to be giving you a little bit of background to and context. So back in 2019, a report published by the EEA entitled Sustainability Transitions indicated that a knowledge gap exists on how governments and societies can respond to dynamically changing needs to ensure sustainability. Now, back in 2019 as well, it was indicated that sustainability transitions is a recently new field of research that it has grown exponentially in the past few years. In 2019, more than 500 papers were published on the topic alone. But what are sustainability transitions, and what do they have to do with the topic that we're about to discuss? That is climate repair and reparations. Now, sustainability transitions refer to the systemic changes needed in societies in response to the environmental crisis we are facing. Climate change is a prime example of the need to work together to achieve systemic changes so badly needed to address all the environmental disaster that we're facing. So the question then arises about our roles and how we're advancing research. This means we have to act in a multidisciplinary and multidimensional fashion, and to continue with basically how we can do this. It's like race, gender, and economic inequalities and socio-geographical locationality are intersectional injustices that leave least developed countries facing existential threats that are disproportionate to emissions. Despite accounting for 1% of total world CO2 in 2019, least developed countries bore 69% of worldwide death caused by climate-related disasters since 1950. The destruction of global climate systems, from ecosystem diversity to the Arctic, and loss of local ecological wealth, including mangroves, forests, and land, disproportionately affect those who are not endowed with the capital to buffer the impacts of climate changes. There arises, therefore, an urgent need to repair the ecosystem ravaged by climate change. While adaptation and mitigation are the primary focus of climate intervention, a third priority is repairing the very ecosystem that sustains life on Earth. This interactive panel explored the importance of climate repair in conversations of climate reparations and how sustainability transitions can play a role in advancing them. So with this on, I'll now ask the speakers to introduce themselves again a bit more and start. So Elin, I'll have you here first. So I'll get the slides going for you here and then just come to the podium. Thank you.
So this discussion is all about. So are there any success stories? If so, what and are there any mechanisms that we can influence? Some of the big discussions happening here in Dubai, some of the big discussions happening all over the big discussions happening all over the and so on. So what are the success stories?
Okay. When we sort this technical problem, should we go to one of the speakers on
Yeah,
okay, we'll do that. Yeah. Okay. When we solve the technical issue, hold on. Now I think there is a delay. Okay. So put it in presentation mode now. That should do it. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, Elliot.
Hi, my name is Alil. I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge. I look at how vulnerable communities around the world can be better incorporated into climate change policies. Without initiatives to look at how climate change is affecting vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries, we often wind up with policies that don't match the situations that countries are facing. So in this presentation, I want to start by looking at one specific area, which is in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a little island off of India. And this is what the agricultural landscape looks like because of climate change. It's really dry, it's becoming very arid, so that means it's getting hotter and the monsoons are less intense when they're supposed to be happening, but then they suddenly occur with real heavy intensity. Because it's dry, the water just evaporates or disappears. As a consequence, these agricultural areas over time are going to be too hot, too dry for cattle, animals, humans to survive and for food production to continue. It's one of the most significant dangers the dry zone in Sri Lanka is facing, especially when you consider that 60% of arable land in Sri Lanka is in areas like this. Now, this kind of gives you an indication also of how little water is stored in the dry zone of Sri Lanka. Even though it's a tank, which is meant to capture water, by the end of the rainy season, it's just dry and evaporated. I'll just skip through this. Now, when we look at women who are farmers in Jaffna, 30% of farms are operated by women, which is really high for the region. In India, it's closer to 9%. In other parts of the region, it's similar, around 10% or so. But Sri Lanka has 30% of its farms are operated by women, which means that women play a significant role in food production. But when you take a look at the agricultural policies and the climate change policies, you'll see there are zero references that actually talk about the challenges women are facing and what types of policies can help continue with food production, despite the climate changes that women are experiencing. So now we see that women are operating farms in an area that is environmentally inhospitable and get very little support from policymakers as well. We'll just skip this slide actually. Despite living and working in such contexts, we see that women are able to create this type of lush, green, agricultural environments within their farms. And how they're doing this without getting technological support, without getting training support, and no policy support is really a marvel. Now, what I want to talk about in today's presentation is we understand that in areas like Sri Lanka, in areas like Bangladesh, where least developed communities exist, the potential for people, for cattle, animals to live in those areas are slowly disappearing. It's getting too hard in some areas for monkeys and cattle to even exist. So we're not going to be able to see food production 30 years from now in a place like Sri Lanka. In a way, it's saying that it doesn't really matter how much women adapt or how much policymakers create incentives to mitigate the impacts of climate change. When you can't survive in a landscape like the one that we saw earlier, is there like a gap when we're thinking about policy? And in today's panel, we'll see a number of different perspectives on what the gaps are. But for me, the biggest gap is that there are countries on our planet that have produced so much emissions that people like me will not have a home to live in 50 years from now. And the fact that all of our policies are geared towards adaptation and mitigation means that nobody is looking at how do we repair the systems that are creating dry and inhospitable environments. If we start looking at those systems, then who is responsible for repairing them? Some of these systems are so big. If we're talking about how does the North Pole melting impact a little tiny island country like Sri Lanka, which will eventually be flooded quite intensely, who is responsible for that? Where do we find the funds to refreeze the Arctic? Or where do we find the funds to buffer Sri Lanka's coastal zone? And then it comes to the question of reparations. Do we then ask the countries that have emitted over the last 200 years to start paying for these types of repair? I would argue yes. And I would say that it's an existential need. We need to have money and it's not just the financing. We need to have policy structures that start protecting these environments that are incredibly devastated by climate change. We need to start repairing the areas in the planet where ecosystems have broken up so badly that they have repercussive impacts in more vulnerable areas. And personally, for me, I would say it's a call for the people who broke the environment to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elil. Now we can stop screen sharing now, Susan. And then there's a little gap delay on it. So okay, great. So now we'll go to our speakers online. So I have Jessica. Are you ready? Brilliant. So
yes,
thank you very much. Go ahead.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to present here today. I do wish I could be there in the pavilion in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to join you via video link from the virtual David Attenborough building in Cambridge, where I'm a researcher at the Cambridge Center for Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Governance. And my research is focused on the link between specific litigation strategies and outcomes in climate litigation. Put very simply, I want to understand when an NGO or a civil society group or subnational government is building a case theory based either in public or private duties of states and major corporate emitters, which causes of action are capable of unlocking different types of relief available in respect of climate harms. And so I'm sure you've heard a lot about climate litigation this week, and there may even be academics in the room whose research is focused on this. And so I'm sure many of you understand very well the headway that's been made through the courts as a result of claims against corporates and governments to enforce greenhouse gas mitigation objectives. But I'm going to talk today about a different development. It's about an emerging subset of climate cases that are focused on looking at climate justice remedies, including financial compensation for loss and damage. And this is best exemplified by the recent surge of cases brought by subnational governments in the United States against the so-called carbon majors for extreme weather harms. And what these cases are doing is building on both the global climate litigation movement and the successful use of toxic tort claims in other contexts to unlock financial remedies and apportion both responsibility and damages to those with big pockets. And so what you may be asking, does litigation in the US have to do with reparations for least developed countries? And I'm going to posit three things. First is that tort precedent in the US can open pathways for international litigants against US domiciled companies and defendants through different legal mechanisms like the Alien Tort Statute. Second is an incidental benefit, but a benefit nonetheless, which is the vast amount of potential discovery and evidence that can be unlocked in the process. These are global companies with, global carbon footprints, and this alone can result in evidence that can ground future claims in other jurisdictions. And third, more generally, of course, is the development of a greater body of transnational climate jurisprudence, which can be persuasive authority for litigants in the judiciary and other jurisdictions who are seeking to unlock similar types of damages. And what it does is shows how litigators are looking beyond classic typologies in climate litigation to explore successful claims in other circumstances, analogous circumstances like toxic tort litigation in the tobacco and big pharma cases, for example. So what do we know about climate case strategies so far? We know that litigants are relying on a range of very clever domestic legal theories targeting actors who bear responsibility for contributing to climate harms. And we've seen a range of causes of action grounded in private law, including the tort of negligence, which is for claims relating to personal injury and harm, nuisance, which is harm to property. We've seen claims grounded in company law, including corporate governance claims, directors' duties, fiduciary duties, and of course, rights claims, which are grounded in the government obligations to protect and not to interfere with human and constitutional rights. And a new and interesting area that we're starting to see as well are claims grounded in consumer protection. So fraudulent misrepresentation and racketeering now, which is a new area, an American term that refers to the act of acquiring business through illegal activity or to extract illegal profits. And so what about remedies? Thus far, we've seen that there have been some very notable successes in unlocking specific performance or injunctive remedies. These are remedies that are forward-looking, and they are looking at mitigation type outcomes. They require a defendant to either stop doing certain acts or to cease the offending act. And the cases that have come out of the Netherlands are a great example of this. These are rights and torts-based claims that have yielded positive results in terms of due diligence remedies. We've seen the courts order the Dutch government and an oil major to achieve certain emissions pathways consistent with the Paris temperature goal. But again, where's climate justice in this picture? Mitigation and diligence remedies don't entail any compensation for past acts that have resulted in harm. Climate-related loss and damage as a result of extreme weather, for example, we've seen that this has been notably absent from litigants' pleadings. And the reason for this actually appear to be strategic, and there are a number of reasons for that. A lot of it is related to the evidentiary difficulties in establishing the elements of some of these claims and to prove standing. But there have actually been some recent developments which may be path-breaking for litigants who are seeking financial remedies in respect of climate harm. And I'm going to discuss in particular the wave of climate tort litigation that's being brought by cities and states in the United States for climate-related weather harms against the carbon majors, pursuing corporates with deep pockets to assist with covering the very expensive costs of climate repair and adaptation. And what the plaintiffs in these cases are doing is they're building on the successful use of civil tort fraud claims in other contexts, such as tobacco litigation, which combined with consumer protection legislation and anti-racketeering laws has in the past yielded fruitful results. And for those of you who aren't familiar with tobacco litigation, what that ultimately resulted in after many years of litigation was a master settlement agreement where the industry agreed to pay state governments nearly $200 billion to compensate for the increased health costs caused by tobacco use. And it also required the industry to end its disinformation campaign and restricted its future advertising. So the question now is whether toxic tort litigation can do the same thing to big oil. And what we're seeing in these cases is that we have these tort claims being combined with claims about misleading the public with regard to fossil fuel products and misrepresentations about global warming and climate science. And this is what's novel in these cases. And I would say that it's best exemplified by a claim that's been filed by Puerto Rico last year, seeking to hold fossil fuel companies liable for losses resulting from the 2017 hurricane season. And so what is different with this wave of cases compared to past cases which have been unsuccessful in this context? Well, there are a number of things, but I'm going to point to two. First is that they're standing on mounting scientific evidence and factual evidence. We've seen advances in climate attribution science and climate attribution methods, which rely on statistical models to establish probabilistic causation. That's going to be instrumental. And we also have factual evidence now that's been revealed through the course of a lot of studies, which reveals decades of fraudulent concealment and misinformation. So to conclude and to bring it back to the topic of the panel, success in this context, and success, of course, should be defined much more broadly than just winning a case, can have a number of outcomes. It can push the industry into settlement. It can lead to a massive amount of discovery in the process. Again, for global companies, this alone can result in evidence to ground future claims in other jurisdictions. Settlement or a positive tort precedent in the United States can open pathways for international litigants beyond borders against U.S. domiciled defendants through the Alien Tort Statute, for example. It may also bring the industry to the table and for them to ask Congress for immunity in exchange for a more comprehensive climate change legislation package in the U.S. and end some of the anti-climate lobbying from the industry in this respect. And then I'll say a key element of litigation strategy is a good narrative. And the Puerto Rico case creates a very strong factual analogy for small island developing states and least developing countries. For these states, the consequences of climate change are quite literally existential. Storms and sea level rise have formidable implications for these states, and clever narratives and crafted pleadings will provide a useful template for least developed countries and small island developing states bringing these types of claims in the future. So I am going to conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions to the extent that I can.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Now, Karry, I invite you to the basically virtual floor, and if you can also introduce yourself. Thank you.
All right. Can everybody hear me now? All right, cool. So hello, everybody, both in Dubai and online. This is Karry from University of Cambridge and the World Bank. And I'm here at the University of Cambridge right now doing a PhD in development economics. So today my presentation is basically going to focus on like international organizations and how the international community can provide solutions to solve the climate change issues. So first of all, I would like to provide you with a little bit more data on how serious the challenges we're facing now and how far we are still from the goal of the 2050 and limiting global warming to the 1.5 Celsius degrees. So in 2021, global economic losses due to the extreme weather and climate changes amounted to over 300 billion USD, which is about 40% of the global spendings on the energy transitions. And moving forward, we believe that such economic losses will likely to be increased over time. However, although climate change is indiscriminating in terms of rich and poor, the severity of the consequences to the groups are different, which means the poorest are hit hardest. So over the last few decades, 9 out of 10 deaths and 60% of the economic losses from disasters happening in developing countries. A quarter of the world's population is directly exposed to substantial food risks, with 90% of them living in the low and middle income countries, and 40% of them are poor and extremely poor. Last year in Pakistan, flooding covers 1/3 of the country and affected 33 million people, killed 1,700 people, and displaced 8 million people. This year in Libya, Cyclone Daniel caused 2 dams to fail, killed more than 4,000 people. Years of drought in Somalia exposed the country to the biggest risk of famine, which directly impacted over 7.8 million people. So given the huge disparity between many low and middle income countries and others in the CO2 emissions, vulnerability, and climate risk tolerance capability, the international community, especially the multilateral development institutions, share a greater responsibility to help with the climate reparations and sustainable transitions. And what we really mean by saying repairing and reparation here is not simply writing checks to these regions and people, but rather fundamentally transform our current destructive economic system globally by adding in the factors of the climate change into considerations and to take both immediate actions and persistent long-term efforts on the adoption of the low carbon energy and the energy efficiency improvement. So last year, the World Bank delivered $31.7 billion to help countries in climate change monitoring and reparation through its green financing programs and concession loans. UN is also calling for a loss and damage fund here at the COP28. And moving forward, I think the MDBs like the World Bank, European Investment Banks, AIIB, etc., should focus on the following aspects to push forward the process of the green energy transition. Well, first, to increase its investment in solutions that could effectively improve energy efficiency. Well, currently, the global energy intensity, which is the number that we usually use to measure the energy efficiency, is only about 1.3%. And in order to meet the 2050 goal of the 1.5 Celsius degrees, that specific number has to be increased to about 4%. And more financing resources should definitely be delivered to the developing countries on that point. In 2022, the World Bank helped Uzbekistan with a $143 million project in public building energy efficiency improvement. And I think moving forward, similar projects should be carried out in more regions, and developing countries should be provided with additional concession loans on that. And also, I think it's critical for the MDBs to continue to increase their funding investments in climate repair projects in countries that are most vulnerable to the heat of the global warming, from risk preventions to post-disaster management and reconstructions. And such improvements in funding calls for a more diversified financing instruments, including development policy finance, resilience bond, and market-based insurance products. Second, I think multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF share enormous responsibilities in capacity building in terms of the human capacity development, improving the efficiency of the relevant institutions, expanding regulatory capacity through legal framework design and institutional reform, just as my colleague Jessica just mentioned, and customizing the effort towards environmental friendly and sustainability that aligns well with one country's own development goals and priorities. Technical assistance from the multilateral institutions in risk mitigations and disaster management is also critical to those regions with the highest climate risks. And knowledge spillovers, I believe, from the developed countries and those with the leading technologies in green energy solutions should be promoted more by the multilateral agencies. Well, third, I think it's necessary for the MDBs to further help advance and expand the global cooperations and promote the whole of government approaches on the global level. Establishing loss and damage fund is a major global collaboration achievement we see here in Dubai, but certainly it should not be the only one. More joint actions and solutions should be launched worldwide. As for those low-income countries that are most vulnerable to the climate change and relevant natural disasters, the governments of those countries have to increase compensations for the most vulnerable groups and so-called loser group due to the energy transition, for example, the farmers, fishers, miners, and those people who have been struck by the natural disasters. Targeted financial assistance like the low interest loans grants and subsidies should be provided, and social safety net, including the healthcare, unemployment benefits, and emergency relief, is needed in order to provide immediate and direct support to those people. When coming to the investment in infrastructure, developing countries' government also needs to consider investing in resilient infrastructures that can withstand climate-related disasters. This includes building flood defenses, strengthening the buildings against the climate, the extreme weathers, and also considering those infrastructures that including the water conservation systems in the drought-prone areas. So in addition, I think the incoming the World Development Report 2024 of the World Bank has suggested that the governments of the developing countries should effectively utilizing the incumbent advantage to lead the process of technology innovations in clean and renewable energy transitions. And those established companies or entities, including some SOEs, share unique advantages and competitive edges due to their existing presence in the market, resources, capital, and experience. Energy transition needs economies of scale to effectively bring down the cost in production, distribution, and market, and new technology innovations. And incumbents often hold the intensive intellectual property portfolios, which can be leveraged to create new technologies through licensing or legal challenges. More specific policy recommendations on utilizing incumbent advantages and energy transitions will be included in our WDR 2024. Will be launched in the next few months, and we're looking forward to everyone's feedback and hope you all stay tuned on that. All right, so that's all what I want to say, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karry, for that great presentation. Now we'll move on to, you can hear the clapping. Now we'll move on to Pedro now. So Pedro, you can sort of unmute your microphone and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the very interesting discussions so far. So my name is Pedro Schilling. I am Assistant Professor of Finance and Environmental Law at UCL Faculty of Laws. And I'm also a consultant at the Legal Vice Presidency of the World Bank, where I've been working for a number of years, including on the country climate and development reports as well. So my research and advisory work are related to sustainable and climate finance. And one of my main areas of focus is how we can create the enabling environment we need for finance to get where finance needs to be and to get finance out of where it should not be anymore. And that has increasingly included thinking about the financing needs and particularities of areas such as loss and damage and climate repairs as well. So there's over 4 main points. I'll start with a positive note about the progress we have seen in relation to climate and sustainable finance, and especially how our tool set has expanded in relation to previous years. And then I'll move to more challenging points. My second point will be about the issues we're seeing in terms of international coordination between different countries and different institutions. My third point will be about some of the particularities of loss and damage and how we need to bear in mind those particularities if we want to have effective structures in place. And my final point will be about the different kinds of finance that we are discussing as drivers for the transition, and how we should probably also be a bit more critical about getting the right mix for the right areas. So let me start with that positive note. I think it's fair to say that sustainable finance and climate finance, as well as its understanding and regulation, have come a long way over the last 5 years or so. If we think about enabling environments, and that can include increasing climate-related disclosures, reflecting climate-related risks on companies' balance sheets, deploying mechanisms such as green taxonomies or rules for transition finance, we have really advanced quite a bit over the last few years. It does look very different from the promises of what we saw at COP26, for instance, but we have seen actors basically increasing their understanding of the needs of climate change, coming up with solutions in a very rapid fashion. And here I'd like to give one example, central banks. So through the network for greening the financial system and via the Bank for International Settlements, one new regulatory network and one existing regulatory network, we have been able to advance the debates quite a bit and in a speed that has not always characterized regulation in the financial sector. And that's all very important because it affects the whole enabling environment for sustainable and related finance, both domestically but also internationally as well. And generally speaking, we have seen encouraging, I think, developments in regulators and other stakeholders from middle and low income countries as well, which have been contributing to the discussions quite a bit, and especially through the network for greening the financial system. But that leads me to the first challenge I want to discuss, which is the challenge of coordination. So we're seeing quite a bit of uncoordinated movements. Basically, everybody's trying to adapt and come up with solutions, which is great. But we have not been thinking as much about how to make sure those solutions are coordinated and comparable across different countries and across different institutions. This is a problem because the more we have noise when it comes to the initiatives that are being deployed, the harder it becomes to, in the first place, separate best practices from initiatives that don't work so well or that might amount to greenwashing. And second, the harder it becomes to avoid risks related to regulatory arbitrage, which ultimately affect our outcomes and can lead to bad dynamics, such as races to the bottom. So here, I think more about structures that help us to articulate all of those initiatives. So structures and initiatives that facilitates interoperability, which is something we're starting to see a little bit more in the international space, and comparability across different systems. I think what's out there, the IMF very helpfully framed this discussion in their work on geoeconomic fragmentation. And I would say that thinking about those issues can avoid a whole array of headaches, especially down the line. On the multilateral development bank space, I think we're slowly get to that conversation of coordination as well. And some of the announcements at COP28 are an important step in that direction. But that leads to my second challenge, which touches a little bit more on the particularities of climate repair and loss and damage, which is getting the details right. So because of all of that noise, because of the multiple initiatives that we're seeing, we have not necessarily been able to think as much about the details and demands from specific segments, such as climate repair and loss and damage. And I think the discussions on loss and damage provide a very good example here. Because we have been focusing quite a bit on discussions about the substance, and clearly those discussions about the substance of financing are very relevant. So who should contribute to a fund on loss and damages, how much should be contributed, who should benefit, and in which circumstances that should happen. But there are equally crucial reflections needed in terms of the form of financing, because something like loss and damage has fundamentally different needs from other kinds of financing. To give one example here, the speed at which disbursements might need to happen might be often radically different from other fields in sustainable climate finance. And that's what we require from a more structural perspective, different financing structures, and making sure that ancillary structures that are in place, such as the environmental and social frameworks, integrity mechanisms at the multilateral development banks, don't ignore the particularities in those areas as well. I think there are emerging discussions about the relevance of form, and experiences in other areas, such as disaster response, can teach us about the frameworks that need to be in place. But we do more. We need more capacity in that area, and probably more lawyers involved in getting the details right for those financing structures. Otherwise, we can risk important bottom-up inputs getting lost because of an excessively top-down generalistic approach as well. That leads me to my last point. We also need more granularity when it comes to our thinking about the sources and mixes of finance as well. I would say we're in a similar space here. We're seeing high-level approaches emerging, but they risk failing to see some of the important details to get things right. To give one example, again, there's a very substantive push for blended finance as the solution to get from billions to trillions. And that's very understandable to some extent in view of the political economy challenges that are arising from the public crisis and from the fact that we just don't have enough public money to get to where we need to. But that blanket approach might again lose sight of some of the important details that can ultimately kill the push in some specific areas. So for instance, we should be discussing more openly certain market segments and certain areas where relying on such structures is not likely to lead to positive outcomes. To give one example, we have had decades of experiments with blended finance in Latin America when it comes to verticals such as water management, most of which had very, very bad results. Areas such as disaster preparedness might have very similar embedded constraints and might, again, suggest we need different mixes of finance for those areas. I think acknowledging such limitations is important in terms of thinking where we need to be looking for different sources of and models of financing, or where governments will need to prioritize public investments instead of private investments or blended finance. That helps us to ultimately understand where we should be focusing on solutions such as blended finance. In that sense, it highlights how relevant and particularly relevant at the moment are discussions about development grants, and particularly how crucial is the current replenishment side, with the arm of the World Bank that serves low-income countries. That's a very essential part of the equation that needs to get much more attention than it's getting at the moment. And likewise, we need to increasingly try to find out and amplify innovative models that have shown promising results, which goes back to my point about clearing out some of the noise. And here I very much agree with what Karry mentioned, in the sense that there's some outcome-related bonds by the multilateral development banks, sustainable future bonds, carbon bonds, biodiversity-linked bonds, catastrophe bonds, which are pretty interesting, as well as, to give another example, flexible interest rates that reward countries that implement ambitious climate plans, such as the one that the bank just identified. I think those are some of the developments that we should be watching very, very closely. And eventually providing input for topics such as loss and damage and climate repair as well. I think the good news is that we're seeing a lot of progress when it comes to tools, to creating enabling environments to get to where we need to. This includes developments in relation to climate repair, as well as capacity in middle and low-income countries, at least in some instances. But we do have very, very real and important challenges in terms of getting the details right. So in terms of making sure coordination is there, in terms of making sure that we have bespoke structures in areas that needs bespoke, that have bespoke, such as loss and damage, and in terms of making sure that we're pushing the right kinds of finance to the right kinds of sectors. Thank you very much, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And now Tejas is in person here. So Tejas, would you like to speak from here?
So I feel like my laptop's gonna balance on a ledge over here, but thank you very much, everyone, for your comments and for participating in this panel. I know some of you have logged on very early in the morning, and I'm very grateful that you're all here, because we're talking about something that's quite critical. And I think that in sort of being the last speaker on this early career researchers panel, I just want to start off with a few thoughts about this fundamental question about whether there is a moral imperative in the way that we act and the way that we think about climate change and the law. There's clearly an ethical dilemma that's consistently at play in talking about climate change and in discussing climate change, about who bears the responsibility for its impacts. We've seen that the Loss and Damage Fund, and which is now called the Climate Change Impacts Fund, has clearly moved away from this language of responsibility and liability. And the World Bank and all of its funding, and we're lucky to have two people with World Bank experience over here with us, is clearly moving away from a system that holds states accountable for their previous emissions and is moving towards this reconstruction process of ensuring that we are adapting to climate change and responding to climate change as best as possible. That almost shifts the ethical question a little bit forward, because there's no, I think we're almost taking away the question of who is responsible in our minds on the international level, because states are unwilling to be held accountable anymore. However, as Jessica pointed out, and as Karry and Pedro have also highlighted, there is still always the possibility of holding states to account within the domestic legislative structure, because you can hold your government to account for different parts of their actions. It's also very clear that this ethical question is quite important because of the disproportionate effect of climate change on these developed countries, despite their minimal contributions to global emissions. This is something Elil also highlighted in her contribution, and there's nothing I think I want to say too much further on this, but I think that it's pretty evident that all of us share this belief that developed countries have some form of a moral obligation to aid in climate repair owing to their historical emissions. But despite this, there is also the need for some form of global solidarity in climate action, which transcends these national interests of holding people to account necessarily, or holding states to account. The moral implication of ignoring the plights of those that are most affected by climate change are not insignificant. We've already heard from Elil how we're going to see people in states sinking and people losing their homes in years to come. But that process has already started wherever you look around the world, which calls for some form of a re-evaluation of international priorities. Where in that process right now at the UNFCCC COP, participating over here shows us very clearly that there is a moral imperative at the forefront of climate action. However, and this is where I turn to the conversation around climate repair and on funding structures that we've heard from already so far, there is an exclusivity of expertise that I want to critique over here. The complexity and exclusivity of language that's used around climate repair discourse and funding discourse especially is quite epistemologically inaccessible to individuals who actually benefit from these climate repair efforts and benefit from this funding. The language, the technical terms that are used, and the nature of obfuscation that takes place with a lot of these instruments and contracts being signed not from the bottom-up level, but rather vertically top-down, changes the nature of how much people understand how they can access funding and how much people understand the amount of funding that's available to them. And I think that that's quite critical. The technical language also and the advanced concepts in climate science is also inaccessible to several people, not just because of because a lot of these conversations are taking place in English, but also because of the fact that these developed countries do not have the capacity at the moment to actually, as we heard in the previous session, deal with climate law, but also with climate science. In my view, what we therefore need is the democratization of climate knowledge and repair strategies. We already have several programs working on this, including at the University of Cambridge through the Democratizing Education for Global Sustainability and Justice program, which offers courses for future law and policy leaders worldwide. But we do need this democratization to take place a bit further in terms of reducing the amount of technical jargon or making that technical jargon more accessible to people so they actually understand the nature of the instruments that they are accessing. When we talk about blended finance, when we talk about different financial instruments that are being discussed at the COP, those are often only things that people within the blue zone or within the green zone can understand. But they are elements of finance that are accessed by everybody. Similarly, with climate repair technology, it's only typically the scientists who have multiple PhDs who are able to actually understand the nature of that technology that's being used and implemented. However, the on-ground impact and the on-ground implementation really requires everyone to participate in this process. And I think that's quite critical. A lot of on-ground educational and outreach programs are taking place to reduce this complexity and reduce these barriers and create an easier exchange of climate knowledge between experts and non-experts, which I think is quite critical, both from a science and policy perspective, but also from a law and finance perspective. To my mind, a lot of these inaccessibilities and inequities are a repetition of a lot of historical inequities that we see within international law. it's important to acknowledge this because there is almost a parallelism between these historical emissions, who has historically been responsible for inequities that persist within international law, and the number of people that are actually excluded from processes even today. And to my mind, finance is one of the ways in which all of these three things can actually be resolved. The voices of marginalized and affected communities are often underrepresented in global climate negotiations, even when they're taking place over here. We see a lot of side events taking place in parallel at the moment, which is where you're more likely to hear about the voices of marginalized communities. But these do actually need to be within the negotiating rooms, I think, even more than they are today, which requires us to actually understand who is representing states on their delegations, or who is representing parties on their delegations. What is the composition of that delegation itself? Where are the badges being allocated and how? Because one of the things that we see, for example, with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is that it completely excluded fishers and fisher people from South Asia in the process of negotiations. And that is an inequity that could very easily be replicated over here if it's not actually done. I also think that in unlocking further financial tools for this new loss and damage fund, for the new climate response fund, we do need to think about how we can restructure these instruments in order to ensure fairness, and what the yardstick of fairness that we're actually aiming for is. And we also need to recognize and integrate indigenous and local knowledge in all of these climate solutions. More broadly, I think my point is that all legal frameworks have to enforce equitable climate action and some form of reparations where they are owed. And this is more likely to take place at the domestic level, as we heard from Jessica earlier. Finally, I want to conclude with what I think the role of lawyers is in ensuring that the best science actually makes it into policy, and what they can actually do to implement the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. All of this capacity building effort and all of the education and outreach that we do actually does implement the Paris Agreement. We are implementing the Paris Agreement by having this dialogue and this conversation between each other as well. But lawyers also play this extremely important role in translating expertise across different fields into policy instruments, into legal instruments. And I think that translation is a part that was very underappreciated. It's also a part where I think that lawyers can actually play a role in reducing the complex jargon that gets used from the science while translating the science into the policy. Finally, I think that legal expertise as we've seen, is very critical in negotiating international climate agreements. And we've seen from Jessica's presentation already the role of public interest litigation in advancing climate action. But I think that lawyers need a bit more education in climate science and policy in order to be more prepared for the kind of climate repair technologies that are going to emerge, as well as the nature of the different scale of problems that are taking place. As lawyers, I think we're and I'm a lawyer myself, I think we're fairly comfortable in pretending to be experts in things that we're not necessarily experts in. And that's a dangerous position with climate especially. This is not to say that my friends who are here from the World Bank are technocrats. They are very well educated both on the law and the finance side. But I do think that has to be more accessible to people on the ground, especially individuals who are actually implementing the kind of climate action that we want to see. And legal systems have this ability to enforce climate adaptation and mitigation measures, as we've heard already. So if lawyers are better trained in this language, if lawyers are using simpler language, if lawyers are using more accessible language, that's clearly a mechanism by which we can reach the most affected individuals and ensure that they're able to access the kind of justice that they seek. And finally, I think this requires a kind of synergy and collaboration between scientists, policymakers, and legal experts to create comprehensive and effective climate strategies. We see this within our departments at the University of Cambridge. Jessica and I are at the Center for Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Governance. Elilini, Karry, Jessica, and I are all part of the Department of Land Economy, which is an interdisciplinary department that houses a range of scholars who are experts in architecture, economy, environment, law, policy, and science as well. And that the kind of dialogue that we actually get to access on a regular basis means that all of the research that's taking place at the department is fairly informed by how to reach out to an interdisciplinary audience. But that conversation is one that I think we also need to be translating outside the university setting, on the ground, and outside international institutions and on the ground as well. So with that, I will conclude and hand back to Antoinette. But thank you all for coming and thank you for participating online.
Thank you very much, Tejas. And now I would like to invite Elil and Tejas to get some questions from the audience online or in person. So I'll just change microphones. I'll just grab these other ones. Yes. So any questions from the audience here? Yes, okay. I'll move the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Pedro I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. Climate activist working with the grassroots communities on various climate topics. And I like your ideas around loss and damage and also climate financing. But one of the things that we grapple with in my country, as we put it out there, the complexity of all these conversations. And what does that mean? It means that we are leaving out people who really matter in this conversation out of this conversation. I talk about loss and damage. What does loss means to grassroots communities? For example, my country, Kenya, where these communities are feeling the impact of climate change. What does damage mean to them? In the text contained in the loss and damage documents, representative of what my community in the grassroots think about climate loss and climate damage. So basically, in my opinion, I feel like we need to break down all these things so as to also contextualize them. Because what loss and damage would mean to a community, for example, in East Timor, for example, may be different from what a community that is in a tropical area understand by loss and damage associated with the climate change. So those kind of conversations, I think we need to break them down and find a way to reach out to the communities that are actually impacted by climate change. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want to reply to this?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I feel like what you've spotlighted is exactly what a lot of people in the rooms as well believe in, which is why we're seeing a larger number of consultations taking place between the groups and the groups that are placed over here. To give you an example, the LDC Pavilion, for example, is open to everyone to go to, when it's historically not always been. It's a change that's been coming since the past few COPs, where now the LDC Pavilion, you can step in at any point of time and you will likely find at least one member of a negotiating group within the pavilion who is willing to listen to what the community has. However, that of course is dependent on you being here at the COP. So I think a lot more work has to go into having these consultations more, because they do take place. It's not that the consultations don't take place. A lot more work probably has to go into ensuring that everyone interested, all the stakeholders, are invited to these consultations, which means that we need to democratize information about these consultations taking place and ensure that everyone understands how they can make a submission and how they can make the information that these ministers require accessible to these ministers, which is usually in a specific format, usually requiring the use of specific nature of specific kind of language, specific technical expertise, and also requires us, which is sometimes something we forget, also requires us to say why we are experts in what we are. Why is it important that they are listening to us? Which means that, and a lot of communities, especially affected communities and marginalized communities, are communities that are usually also underconfident in leaning on their expertise and leaning on their lived wisdom. And that's something that I think has to change. And I've seen progress in this already since I've been tracking the field, but I know that that's something that we can work a bit more on. I'll pass it on.
I really love your comment, and I like your thinking around it as well. Yeah, absolutely correct. The way people experience climate change is
so vastly different. Unfortunately, the way climate policies, climate funding, all of this trickles down, it's really biased. Society gives values to people's voices. If they think a voice is worth listening to, you will hear it. And what that means is when it comes to climate financing or negotiations, oftentimes it's somebody who's got a valuable voice, in inverted commas, that gatekeeps the ideas and the priorities of people who are most affected by climate change. When it comes to the loss and damage fund, there is a very real danger that it will use the same methods of allocating funding that previous financing instruments have. And which means there's a very real danger that these types of power structures will be replicated. But what is positive is this is the first time that there is a fund that looks at accountability and very blatantly says that if you have polluted historically, then you have a responsibility to the communities that have been affected by your action. So while it is a very progressive step, I'm fully on board with you that we need to make sure that the voices that are heard are not the ones that traditionally have power, but are the ones who are most affected.
Okay, and then now online, now Pedro, would you like to comment? And then I'll go to Carry and Jessica.
Sure, I agree with the points that were made. I can add 2 points to that, again, on potentially one positive and one more negative notes. I think we have very interesting examples in terms of South-South collaboration that, again, gives us very good blueprints for thinking about things that can be scaled up. So in Latin America, for instance, there's a process that was facilitated through UNEP FI to build a common taxonomy of the framework for a common taxonomy between Latin America, which facilitates Latin American countries eventually getting finance to where it needs to be and eventually using that finance in a way that reflects more the needs of Latin American countries. And that's great. We're seeing a good chunk of collaboration between very important stakeholders in Latin American countries that are then more able to be held accountable by local communities and also have participation from those communities in the discussions that are being developed. So that's one thing. Very good examples, I think, of South-South collaboration. I think the biggest challenge we have yet to respond is how do we get the balance between community engagement and focusing on the right places when it comes to things such as loss and damage and scaling up. Because the more you tend to scale up, the more you're trying to mobilize a huge chunk of resources to deal with something, the more you tend to lose on the details and the more eventually funds can go to places you don't want funds to go in the first place. Those sort of new sorts of bonds that I've mentioned, for instance, are potentially a good example in how we're developing metrics that helps us to have community engagement, but also scale up what we're doing. But this is potentially one of the big areas we still need to do more thinking and reflect on the results of what we're seeing.
Thank you, Pedro. Now, Carry, would you like to add any further comments?
I think my colleagues have already covered most of the great points. I just have one more thing to add, and I think, just has been mentioned, the international community and serves the critical functions of setting the standards. However, as many of my colleagues here mentioned, that such kind of standard setting should be customized to the needs of the country, and there should be no one single standard, like in terms of solving the climate risks, the issues. That kind of specific voices from the countries helps with, identifying the unique risks and unique needs. And that is something the international community should listen to and should be addressed.
Thank you, Carry. And Jessica, any further comments?
No, none from me. I think this is covered very well by my colleagues who know much more about climate financing than I. So we can move on, I think, to another question. Thanks.
Thank you. And any other questions from the member of the public? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Pedro. I'm from the United States. I'm from the Rise for Environmental Justice organization and the Science and Community Action Network, which is an environmental justice also network that, we formed it because of the need, right, of the academic structure and the community structure, right, where the voices of the most overburdened communities, frontline communities, also needed to be part of the discussion, part of that research, part of the authorship, part of all those pieces that matter, right, because the lived experience is so important and that value that they hold. And so I guess one of my questions that I have for you at the moment is how is that your funding or where your funding comes to your academic institutions, how is it not restricted to serve the industry? Because when we talk about the fossil fuels and financing, a lot of this money also comes from the fossil fuel industry. So I just wanted to see like what kind of response from that, because we see it, right, perpetuating harm, although there's a lot of good academics, great academics that want to do the right thing and work in partnership and in trust-building relationships with community. But in order to achieve those climate goals, right, we need to also look at that other piece, like, wait a minute, my funding's coming from here, and I'm trying to do this. So just if you can answer that.
Okay, so who was to answer that question first? Online? Oh, Ellie? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, so I understand your question is really about academic integrity. When you are funded perhaps by someone who's got their fingers, then your research is also equally studied. I am proud to say that a number of us at the university don't accept funding, and we were even talking about this last night, where we've had people try to offer us funding, but then we've said no, we don't want it because it doesn't align with what we believe in. So I don't know if that gives a little bit of encouragement in the sense that not everybody is driven by money. And I think also that it's a really important stance to take to say that we don't want your money. You can't just greenwash your actions by like publishing 60 different articles that say yay, all good. So I mean, I just hope that gives you a little bit of hope that not everybody is that way, and I'm with you on shaming anyone who does.
I share that moral commitment, but I take a slightly different approach, only because I'm aware that these are the organizations that have the funding available. And I think that a lot of these processes require their participation. And they actually require them to do good, not just say that they're doing good, but genuinely do good. I think the university structures committing to divest, first of all, and committing in general to also no longer collaborate with fossil fuel industries, which is something the University of Cambridge has recently committed to after a review by the high-level climate champion. I think Dr. Nigel Topping led an internal review at the University of Cambridge, which is now committed to not doing that going forward. But I do believe that the continuation of unrestricted research money, where it is given purely for research purposes and then you're left to do what you require with it, can still lead to positive outcomes where you can actually exercise your academic independence. There's a fine line between your academic independence getting compromised by where your funding source comes from and your academic independence actually being enhanced as a result of you having funding. Because there are several academics who will not be able to actually execute their ideas if they aren't giving the funding that they require. So where it's unrestricted and your academic independence isn't compromised, I'm sort of open to that conversation, I think, as long as that promotes a certain kind of research, I believe. But I think that that's an open question that also requires like a scale of morality, effectively. And requires us, I think, to have that conversation without prejudging each other on that question. So that's just my view. Anyone online? Pedro, Jessica, Carry, if you have anything to add?
Okay, so we have another question here as well. Now, and if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Annika Bella. I'm a member of the delegation of the Commonwealth of Dominica. It's not the Dominican Republic. It's another small island developing state in the Caribbean region. And my question, or my contribution really just centers around data-driven research, particularly in the Caribbean region. I know for us, when it comes to climate change and a lot of environmental issues, we are often looking in Latin America and the Caribbean, but the Caribbean itself has very specific concerns and very limited resources and capabilities in terms of research and data collection. So I just want to know, and probably this is also a suggestion, but in conducting research across universities in the global north and developed countries, how much consideration is given to there are specific regions who face challenges who are often considered in conversation, but how often do you collaborate with universities in these sorts of regions, like in the Caribbean, who lack that capacity and lack the funding necessary to do critical research in the area of climate change and environmental protection? So I'll give an example. The University of the West Indies is the premier institution in the Caribbean which conducts data. A lot of the data comes from the University of the West Indies, but we do need a lot more support in that regard. And how do your universities go about conducting research? Do you partner with these universities? How exactly is the process done, maybe to assist developing countries through building capacity through the universities?
Thank you. Anybody want to? Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, Jessica or Pedro or Karry, who would like to take this question first? Jessica, would you like to reply to that question? Oh, okay. Ellie is happy to answer. Okay.
No, I'm also not sure if they can hear the questions.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm gonna double check.
Were you able to hear the question?
No, hold on. Were you able to hear the question online?
Yeah, I can hear the question, and I can add a little bit word on that. I think absolutely that the research, the funding for the research is a critical element in the whole process of coming up with the solutions to the climate change. And I think the multilateral institutions like the World Bank specifically focus on the research in this area. So in terms of the World Bank, like yeah, I'm not quite familiar with the IMF and the others, but the World Bank has research departments looking in each country offices, and economists are specifically working on the environmental issues. And I think the fundings from the bank perspective has been increasing gradually over the years in those regions, in Latin America as in other developing countries. And I think moving forward, it is essentially for the multilateral institutions to create a network looking in research and fostering the knowledge spillovers in this area to increase, the knowledge to move towards the countries that has been facing the biggest risks of climate.
Thank you, Karry. And
yeah, I think that's a great question. I think academic collaboration can often be treated as a way to expand your network, but also be tokenism, where it's not true academic collaboration. And it's almost treating yourself as the main partner because you're at a better university, according to traditional empirical metrics that are, as we know, are fairly bogus. But what we're starting to see, especially in the climate space, especially in spaces that are actually focused on sustainable development, is that researchers who genuinely believe and understand what the sustainable development goals call for, and understand what partnerships for the goals genuinely means, are researchers who aren't engaging in this tokenism. As an example, from the University of the West Indies, we have Dr. Mohsin Al-Attar, who was the head of the Department of Law for a short while, for 2 years, and is a fairly renowned critical international lawyer. The traditional notion of countries that aren't in the global north is that all the lawyers in the global south are critical international lawyers and they can't really collaborate across as well. However, Mohsin is one of the people at the University of West Indies Faculty of Law, are one of the faculties that have broken that barrier fairly significantly, especially also with their alumni such as Douglas Lee's King Counsel, who's the former General Counsel of the Green Climate Fund, also breaking through the barrier in practice. So I think that the more educated and aware we become about the range of universities around the world, around the range of academic partners, and that's an onus on us as academics to do that outreach, to do that research. I think that we can foster greater collaboration that treats academic partners as equals and treats alumni of all universities or any educational system really, not just university setups, as an equal contributor to our research. A small way of doing this, for example, is changing what you call your fieldwork assistants from field assistants to research assistants or research collaborators, which changes the very nature of the way that you collect data from the field and the kind of respect that you give the people who are helping you collect the data. These are small things that I think actually can make a huge difference. So,
thank you, Tejas. Elilini?
This is such a complex question. Like, I don't even know where to start, but I would like to say that, it is really a problem of the way knowledge is produced in a post-colonial world. You have a lot of countries that were stripped of resources, completely restructured, and then sort of like set off, stripping them of their academic and educational histories and resources as well in the process. And then at the same time, you have education and knowledge that's almost kept by the English language. Publications, who is doing the research, how you communicate research, where you communicate research, is so driven by the Western world that oftentimes countries like the Caribbean or other countries are left behind in that process as well. So there are like serious systematic issues that contribute to the situation that you described in your question. I do think that's changing now. More and more people who are affected by climate change or other issues of justice or poverty or whatever it might be, they have ways of having their voice heard online or through partnerships in universities. And then you also have better representation. Like even me being able to be in the UK is something that's historically unusual, So I think that there is more diversity that's emerging in the way knowledge is produced. So with that context being said, if you're interested in partnering, then I think the best way to do it would be to find someone who you find interesting, their work is interesting, and literally just like email them, connect with them, and then try to see where you can find funding for like a collaborative piece of research, because that's how open education is right now. So I definitely see a lot of possibilities for doing collaborative research in that way. By the way, I also know where Dominica is. My sister was there for like 4 years. It's like amazing.
Thank you very much, Elil. And now we're sort of running out of time. So with one word to our speakers, if you can sort of summarize or sort of feel how you feel about the day. I will go online first. So Jessica, with just one word before we finish, what you will summarize the session today.
Okay, I will try to summarize the session in one word by saying that I think what I really love about Tejas' research is that I really feel like the way that he is talking about our communication tools and these epistemic communities really helps us to, be in an environment like this where we have 4 or 5 multidisciplinary researchers, all of whom can bring our unique perspective and expertise to addressing a very, this similar problem. So I learned a lot today, and I hope you did as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just one word. How will you summarize the session?
Hopeful.
Thank you. Elil?
Hopeful.
Hopeful. Elil? Put in the spot.
Burning, like inside.
Great. Pedro, one word.
I'll do 2, which is cautiously optimistic, basically.
Great. And then Karry?
Well, for one word, I think I will use the fruitful to conclude. Yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll have the recording online as well, sort of we'll share at some point when it's all edited. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.